Good morning, everyone, and thanks to all of you for this overwhelming response to this webinar announcement. We are going to talk today about what is not being counted when it comes to impacts of climate change, specifically along the Bay of Bengal coast, the coast of Bangladesh, and the 4 states of India, which are along the coast of the Bay of Bengal, West Bengal, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. We have a very strong lineup of panelists to explain to us what are these uncounted costs, which the United Nations, in its love for jargon, describes as NELD, non-economic loss and damage. So essentially, these are impacts that we are facing and which are not really being taken into account by our policymakers when they make budgets or when they act on adaptation or resilience issues. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time today because I want this session to be as interactive as possible. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time to introduce the speakers. They're all experts in their field. What we are going to start. However, before I call upon the first speaker, I also wish to tell all my journalist colleagues gathered here that as part of this project, we are offering story fellowships. We have a call for applications for story fellowships on non-economic loss and damage in this region along the Bay of Bengal coast out right now. My colleague Manasi is going to paste the link to the story fellowship call in the chat very soon, and you are all encouraged to apply for these story fellowships. I have a strong feeling that what you hear and what you learn during the webinar today is really going to help you get some story ideas. Then, having said that, I'm going to start with the first speaker, who's going to be Harjeet Singh. Harjeet is the founder director of Satata Samprada Climate Foundation. He is also the person who has been tracking and pushing for loss and damage to be included in the global negotiations and for money to come to affected communities for all the losses and damages being suffered due to climate change by all of us. So I think he's the best person to give us both a perspective into what has happened and an idea of what is likely to happen. Over to you, Harjeet.
Thank you so much, Jyoti, for having me. And this is such an important conversation. So, and you've asked me to just set the context. So I'm going to share a few slides. Let me know when you are able to see my screen.
Yes.
And when it is full screen mode.
Not yet.
How about now?
Yes, now it's in full screen. Thank you.
Okay. Right. So I have 10 minutes and I'll try and cover the conceptual part in these few minutes. So without getting into a lot of details, which I'll keep for the conversation. But this is to just share how we look at different range of climate impacts. I'm sure many of you must be familiar with this infographic that United Nations came up with. And as Jyoti said, after a lot of pushing, in fact, if you know, the issue of loss and damage was not even recognized by the UN system for a very long time. So this fight is as long or as old as the convention itself. It started in 1991. But eventually, when we got the first mechanism agreed in 2013, that's when UN started churning out some of these infographics and papers. And that's how we have seen this knowledge system on loss and damage evolving, although slowly. So when you look at these impacts, when we talk about extreme weather events, we are familiar with most of them: tropical cyclones, drought, floods, heat waves. But slow onset events are the ones which still have not got as much attention. We don't talk about desertification enough. Yes, heat waves are a lot more prominent now. But when we look at land and forest degradation, loss of biodiversity, glacial melt, we don't really talk about ocean acidification, for example, which also means that we have not even started measuring the impacts both in terms of economic and non-economic losses. And at the bottom of the infographic, you see the categorization of economic and non-economic losses. And I must say, while we continue to use this term, non-economic loss and damage, it is actually quite misleading, because people think that when we talk about non-economic, it means non-financial. And I'll talk about that very briefly. To keep it simple, these are basically social, cultural, and environmental impacts, which are known as non-economic. Because if you look at the categorization done by the UN, it talks about loss of life, impacts on health, human mobility, loss of territory, which is now we are seeing permanent in nature, loss of cultural heritage, loss of indigenous knowledge and cultural identity, loss of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and so on. So there's a huge range of impacts that we are now beginning to recognize. And of course, the reason we are talking about it today, and main challenge has been that you cannot really measure them in monetary terms, but that doesn't mean that they do not have a value. And that's where we talk about cultural heritage and mental health and so on. And it is often overlooked in climate discussions, but it is extremely important when you talk to communities. They do talk about how they are being impacted, and some of these impacts cannot be really measured, but are really important for their well-being. Just to give a little bit of conceptual context, and as I said, over the last few years, this knowledge has been evolving. So when we talk about various categories, and I mentioned some of them, which are now included in the infographic. It's also to recognize that some of these are more related to individual-centric impacts. There are some which have implications on the society, and there are some which are related to environment. Of course, they are not they're distinct yet connected with each other. And there is another way of looking at it. So academicians have also tried to define them as having intrinsic value, and there are ones who are instrumental for their day-to-day lives when we talk about production systems and cultural sites and ecosystem services, and even the agency and identity that is linked to a particular community. So there are different ways of looking at some of these non-economic loss and damage. Now, because this project is focused on Bay of Bengal, of course, most of these impacts we see in this part of the world, but particularly which are more visible are loss of livelihoods due to saltwater intrusion. And we are seeing how communities are facing these impacts, especially impact on agriculture. And fish stocks are dwindling. When we speak to fisher folks, they tell us how there has been a change in the movement of fish. And of course, climate change is not the only factor. We are also seeing increasing levels of displacement and migration. Recently, there's a lot of discussion about it, but when it comes to policy, we really have not understood how we are going to deal with the scale of displacement and migration that's happening, which is not only causing economic disruption, but is also having impact on the overall society. Mental health, which I briefly mentioned, we are also seeing anxiety and depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. We also see erosion of cultural identity and traditional knowledge, which can be connected to displacement and migration, which is having at an unprecedented scale already. Now, when we talk about challenges, why we still do not talk enough about these non-economic losses and damages. One, there's limited data availability on the impacts. As I mentioned, there are a range of impacts. And when we talk about our response to disasters, we normally do not take into account the entire range. And because of the difficulty in measuring and valuing these so-called intangible losses, there is also no standardized methodology to assess. I think the whole data and assessment part is extremely weak. There are also concerns about attribution. The science has evolved a lot over the last few years, but we also know that this is always going to be quite contentious, especially when we attach it with payments and the finance that needs to be provided. When we talk to policymakers, there's still very limited awareness, and what we need to be doing a lot more advocacy for some of these approaches to be included by policymakers in the measures that are taken. We also see even at the community level, uh, both at the government and community level, there's a capacity constraint on how to really deal with those impacts, and especially when we look at them more at the society level and at the environment level as the categorization I was presenting. And all these aspects then lead to weak or inadequate institutional frameworks for addressing some of these long-term consequences. And of course, finance remains a major issue because of the name itself. As I said, it can be misleading. And that's why I'm presenting this slide for us to know. And of course, it's put that in these categories, but it's not a watertight category. So when we talk about addressing these impacts, it requires so-called financial and non-financial measures. And when we say financial and non-financial, it means really money being provided to communities and directly, especially. So when we say communities who are losing some of those cultural sites or some of these their resources, we also provide them and direct financial aid. And when we talk about traditional livelihoods being lost and which is connected to their knowledge, we need to make efforts to restore that, and that's going to require finance. Similarly, when we see some of these impacts that are happening, we also need to provide relocation and resettlement support and compensation for lost cultural heritage, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. And one more aspect, which is connected to the point that I made earlier, we need to also provide money for research on these impacts and also look at the strategies to address them. So of the non-financial, which means that, of course, we need financial resources, but the services that we provide to affected people are non-financial in nature. And that's where we provide them mental health care, psychosocial support networks. Also, when we do ecosystem restoration and cultural heritage restoration, that's more at the community level. We also need to talk about how do we preserve and promote intergenerational knowledge sharing initiatives. It's also about language and identity preservation, especially when communities are being displaced. Another aspect which is again huge, especially relevant for our region, is how the scale of climate-related migration is increasing and how we need to look at the legal recognition. There's a term that we normally use called climate refugees, which technically it's incorrect because the refugee definition doesn't really include climate migration. So the legal recognition is a missing piece. And again, our region, how to look at the cross-border migration and how we can do more cooperation on climate migration. And I will also say on adaptation, which can address some of this distress migration that we are seeing. My last two slides, I'm sure we're going to be discussing a lot more going forward, but just to give us a head start, because of all the reasons that I mentioned, there's very little awareness, and that's why this conversation on how do we really capture some of these issues. Of course, we all know that human interest stories are one of the best ways to communicate when we profile individuals and families who are impacted, not only talk about their struggles, but also the measures that they have taken or they have been supported with to address these impacts. Mental health, just to put a spotlight, some of these aspects are not talked about as much, and especially when communities lose their cultural sites or loss of biodiversity, how it impacts their mental health. Data-driven stories are required. Yes, there's a lack of data, but we also need to do a lot more analysis and highlight how we can use data to tell a story, doing it more in the form of visualization to communicate the complex issue to a wider audience. This is my last slide. When we talk about stories, we also need to talk a lot more about solution, and especially when we are living in a doom gloom scenario, it's important to talk about successful community-based initiatives. We also need to mention the role of academia, international organizations, civil society in supporting these interventions. And last but not the least, we need to do more investigative and in-depth reporting of the government policies. As I said, even on migration, policies don't exist across South Asia when it comes to looking at the range of impacts that people are facing from migration perspective, right to stay, right to move, and all that. And then exploring the challenges of measuring and valuing non-economic loss and damage so that we can connect that with the advocacy for compensation and efforts to address them. I'll stop here and very happy to have a conversation later. Over to you, Jody.
Thank you so much, Harjeet. So for everybody, the way we have planned this is that please put your questions in the Q&A box over here. And we have requested everybody, all the panelists, to make their presentations short so that we have the maximum possible time for Q&A. And I'm very glad that Harjeet stuck to his allotted time, apart from everything else. Right. As Harjeet pointed out, I think one of the biggest impacts that are not being valued properly are impacts on our health. To talk about this, we have two eminent experts. First, we are going to listen to Dr. Soma Swaminathan, now the head of MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. Dr. Swaminathan, over to you.
Thank you very much. And greetings to all the colleagues who are on this call, and also congratulations to the Earth Journalism Network for raising the profile of this very important topic. As you mentioned, the so-called non-economic impacts are actually the ones that I think may be impacting people the most, even though countries may and UN agencies may be calculating the economic impacts differently. But we've heard very nicely from Harjeet the very major and wide-ranging impacts that happen. Now, MSSRF has been working with coastal communities for a long period of time, and this was actually enhanced after the tsunami. And we have a center called the Fish for All Research and Training Center in Pumpuhar in Nagapattinam district. And we believe in working in a participatory way with the coastal and fishing communities, as well as co-creating solutions. And from the very beginning, I think the foundation recognized that climate change is going to have a very big impact on coastal communities. And clearly after the tsunami, everyone recognized that this was a threat, not just an acute or a rapid onset one like a cyclone or a hurricane. But of course, less well recognized are the slow-moving threats that Harjeet talked about. That is a gradual salinization, the fact that the resources in the sea are going down, and so on. So we, as an example, developed something called the Fisher-Friendly Mobile App. And these are the kind of solutions that one can co-create with communities based on their needs and their lived experiences. So the fishermen obviously wanted some kind of early warning tool that they could use, that they could look at every day or every few hours with an updated data to tell them whether it was safe to go fishing or not, to tell them what the wind was going to be like, what the weather was going to be like, which direction they should go in. But it wasn't just the weather and the warning, which one expects them to want. But then they added on several other requests, like, for example, where the fish, particular types of fish are likely to be, in which season, which fish, they should avoid fishing, how to avoid catching juveniles and other marine and mammals as well, what kind of techniques they could use. And I'm talking about small fishermen here. That is the same, the artisanal or traditional fishers, and not the big trawlers. So then market-related data, linkage to markets, linkage to prices, linkage to government schemes, but also things like marine, national borders, boundaries, so that they get a warning alert before they stray into waters of another country, as well as a warning when they are approaching turtle nesting sites. So some of the requests came from state government, some of them came from. We've done now a similar exercise with the fisher women. And the fisher women, of course, take the entire burden of post-harvest fisheries. So once a fish have been hauled into the shore, everything is from drying, any value chain addition and to marketing is done by women. And there's a lot of drudgery involved in their work. Things are getting more difficult for both the men and the women. I was in Rameshwaram recently and talking about traditional livelihoods. I met the women who do this traditional seaweed when they dive in and catch the sort of harvest seaweed with their hands and put it on their backs and then come back. And they have said that there's been a dramatic decline in the availability of seaweed, and their harvest is going down, and obviously their income is going down. They also raised many issues around the fact that compensation as well as insurance coverage is mainly for the men who get registered in the community, in the schemes, and as usual, women are left behind. So there's a very big gender element to the impacts, even normal programs that are delivered to communities, but particularly when it comes to climate change and women are impacted disproportionately. So coming to the health impacts, I think I would just like to say that, again, women are disproportionately impacted. I'll give you a little bit of examples. Last year, we were asked to do a scoping review by the Ministry of Women and Child Development on the impacts of climate change on women and children. While this was not focused on coastal areas or the Bay of Bengal, I think we uncovered a lot of things which are very relevant. The first thing was that there is no one place in which you could actually find this type of documentation of what are the health and livelihood impacts of climate change, particularly on women. So what we did was bring climate data and some models that have been done by agencies like CEEW, who have developed climate vulnerability maps of India. And I think recently they have updated it also. So 80% of Indian districts are vulnerable to hydromet disasters, that is floods, cyclones, or drought. And if you add heat, then I think the whole of India really gets covered. We also know from IMD now that the coastal districts are very vulnerable to these kind of disasters more and more because of, again, many factors, including ocean warming and the way the wind currents are changing. But also large parts of India are exposed to heat. And heat with humidity has not been really well looked into. So coastal areas we know are generally more humid. The same temperature has much higher biological impact. And heat with air pollution is another area where scientists are finding that when you combine heat and air pollution, the combined impact is several-fold higher than exposure to either of these alone. Now, what we found in terms of impacts are clearly that when you have an exposure to any of these disasters, either slow-moving or the more rapid ones, there is an impact both on physical and mental health. We found a significant increase in undernutrition, for example, both in women and children, a decline in access to health care like antenatal care facilities, immunization. You can see drops in all of those. We saw an increase, a very significant increase and rise in interpersonal violence, gender-based violence, particularly domestic violence, but also reports of gender-based violence in shelters, which are often set up after disasters, and a lack of wash facilities, a lack of facilities for menstrual health for women, an increase in sexual violence, and so on. These are not things that have been very well captured, but the data was very, very clear when we looked at it. Of course, there has been a fair amount of modeling done on the increase in vector-borne diseases, particularly again in our cities, our coastal cities, which are prone to flooding and water stagnation. Again, that's because our urban infrastructure has not really been designed in a way in which we could actually conserve the natural water flows that existed in the past. And so we blocked all of that, and therefore we result in repeated flooding. Tremendous increase in dengue, for example, but also in Zika and certain other vector-borne diseases, leptospirosis, and other waterborne infections. And because of coastal warming of the sea and algal blooms that are likely to occur, an increase in Vibrio. That is, Vibrio is the bacterium that causes cholera. And so Vibrio cholera, and so cholera outbreaks are much more likely to happen as well. On the mental health side, I think there's been much less systematic research done, though there is a growing body of evidence, but less from low and middle income countries, and certainly very little evidence from coastal communities. But whatever we could gather, and there's also modeling done to show that as heat increases, and this is what our expert psychiatrists told us, that people who have psychiatric illnesses like schizophrenia, they deteriorate, and the increase in suicide that happens during the high heat days is significantly increased. And that, I think, is related to mental stress increasing. Now, there are, of course, chronic impacts like the lack of sleep and things like that, which are recorded, which will have an impact, I think, on health. So we are setting up a program now through the foundation, but in collaboration with many others, to look at the impacts of heat on health in people living both inland as well as in coastal communities. So high humidity versus low humidity. Focusing on physical and mental health impacts. We will measure exposures through putting in monitors that will capture all the climatic variables. We will also have people wearing monitors on themselves to capture the impacts on heart rate, respiratory rate, and so on, because we know that heat exacerbates cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, neurological disease, psychiatric disease, and there are certain thresholds beyond which the human body may not be able to adapt. So I think that is the most worrying thing for the Bay of Bengal, that these thresholds, which can be measured by wet bulb temperatures, are likely to get breached in the next several decades. We don't know when, depends on the rate of global warming and how it goes. But if that temperature gets breached, that is a wet bulb temperature, which is heat plus humidity, then the human body can no longer adapt to heat, and then systems start shutting down. So as a medical person, I'm really very, very concerned that in parts of India, we may be already approaching that kind of thing, which means that many areas will become uninhabitable. And then finally, on adaptation, I think that we need to do much more research, but also implementation of affordable and context-specific solutions to protect us from these hazards. And this has to be both in infrastructure, in systems, the training of healthcare providers, for example, specifically, how do we deal with some of these climate-related issues? How do we deal with the gendered issues which are coming up now, the impacts of climate change, and building community resilience? This word is, of course, used very often, building resilience, but what does it mean? Really, I think we need to deep dive into that, work with our communities, and figure out ways where people can, not everybody has the financial resources to put in air conditioners, and we know air conditioning is not a long-term environment-friendly solution. On the other hand, as I mentioned, human bodies need a certain optimal temperature. So it's going to result in economic losses, huge. So I think this whole thing of non-economic loss and damage will very soon have to change, because each of these things, if your body is affected, you can't work. Obviously, your productivity goes down, the economy gets impacted. I think there's increasing realization of that. But it's urgent now that we focus on adaptation and on finding, and India is a huge and heterogeneous country. So what's relevant for one part of India may not exactly be appropriate, because we have also so many climatic and agroecological zones. So we need to do much more decentralized kind of work, but share the findings, share our workable solutions so that they can be scaled up. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swaminathan. Okay, here's a message for all participants here. I know Dr. Swaminathan has another meeting and has to go. Is there any urgent question for Dr. Swaminathan? While you are thinking about it, I have what is a request, but not a question, is that the report that you talked about, Dr. Swaminathan, just now, where you worked with the CEW data, if you could make that available to journalists, I think that would be very useful.
I'll share the link. Yes.
Thank you. Is there any question? Does anybody have any immediate question? If not, then
Actually, Joydeep, sorry,
yeah.
I had a question for Dr. Samya, and what kinds of stories would you like to see, Dr. Swaminathan, in the media? When they cover any LD with specific reference to health. I mean, what are the kinds of headlines, and what do you think can really help you, people like you, push for better policies and resources towards this?
So I would definitely like to see more stories on the gendered impacts of climate change, because when we do an analysis of, for example, the state action plans on climate change and health, or even specifically heat action plans, there are very, very few which have actually considered the differential impacts on women, and let alone gender sensitive. We would like them to be gender transformational, but they're not even gender sensitive. And so just picking up, because many people think men are working outdoors, they are the ones exposed to heat, but that's not true at all, because our indoor environments, we have such poorly built and designed indoor environments, and many poor people live in housing with very little ventilation and like iron corrugated roofs, where the indoor temperatures are higher than outside. So the messaging that generally goes out to stay indoors, but actually they're much worse off indoors. And they have a lot of ideas on how things could be improved. So voices from the community, especially the traditional ways that used to be used for cooling, which are now disappearing. I think those kind of solutions, and also these kind of forgotten traditional livelihoods, like these women who do the seaweed cultivation, the women who do prawn, hands, using their hands, these are all dying out because of many reasons. And how can we actually provide them either alternative livelihoods or using their skills, or bring the government's attention to certain things which can be done, which can definitely provide in the short and medium term some relief for them. I gave one example of women not being covered by the insurance program. The payout goes only to the man. If the man dies, then even if the woman is now doing the fishing, she doesn't get the benefits that the husband used to get.
That is very serious. I'm seeing one question from Dipin Damodaran. How is climate change impacting the education of children living in coastal areas? One impact we know is that so often school buildings and college buildings are used as cyclone shelters and storm shelters, which takes away from the school days and college days to a very large extent. Dr. Swaminathan, is there any other impact that you found on education?
I think on children, one thing is, of course, the school closures, and governments resort to school closures as a first point, of whether it is heat or cold, or whether it was COVID, or whether it's air pollution. Schools get closed, and so the poorest children end up suffering because they lose their education, which they're not going to make up by sitting at home. They can't do online. They also lose their midday meal and so on. So there's a big setback. And so closure of school should be the last resort. But obviously that means you've got to build infrastructure which is climate resilient. If you're in a flood prone area, then your schools and your health centers must be located in places where they can't be flooded. You must have alternate electricity sources, maybe renewable energy and things like that. But the other impact, I think, is on the mental health, because there is growing feeling, especially amongst psychiatrists I've spoken to, that this climate anxiety or eco-anxiety is growing among children and particularly adolescents. And there is a feeling of helplessness. They can see their parents struggling, right, with the traditional livelihoods. They don't want to be in those livelihoods because they don't see a future there. They also don't see a great future anywhere else because they may not necessarily have the resources and the skills to compete with other mainstream students. And so I think this whole focus on skilling is very important, but if it can all be focused towards green skilling and giving people who are going to lose their traditional livelihoods, like the next generation of children of these women seaweed farmers, not one is following the mother because they don't see a future there. So what are those children going to do? They can't all go into white collar jobs. They need jobs which can sustain them, where they can still live in those villages, but still have economically productive life. So I think more thinking needs to be done. And maybe there are very good examples, I'm sure, in India. There are amazing innovations that are happening. Those stories need to be brought out. But I think young people need a lot of mental health surveys have shown that the 18 to 24-year age group currently has very poor mental health. This is global, but in India also it's very acute. Very recent surveys have shown this. And so I think we need to take that very seriously. Part of it is definitely the impacts of climate change and the future that they see for themselves.
Thanks. There is a question from Chiranjeevi Kulkarni saying, could you please throw light on the kind of health infrastructure required? Our current infrastructure seems to be unable to assess and care for climate-related health stress.
So I think for each, again, region of India, like I said, now we know the hazards, because I think this has been well mapped by many agencies, including CEW. So district by district, we know we need to go sub-district also and do vulnerability assessment. On the one hand, it's the climate hazards. On the other hand, it's your own vulnerability. So not all women are equally vulnerable. Not all people in the district are going to be vulnerable. The poorer ones are definitely the first to be impacted, by displacement, by flooding, by whatever it is. So I think every district needs to have a plan now as to what are the main hazards and how do they protect. In some places, it's going to be extreme cold. In other places, it's going to be heat or flooding. And so the systems will have to be upgraded to meet those challenges. For example, heat. IMD has already put out weather warnings. Large parts of India are going to face heat wave days in the coming 3 months. Are all health centers equipped? Do we have cool rooms? Do we have cool ice? For example, we don't have air conditioning everywhere, but can we at least provide ice and very cold water to make sure that people who come in with heat stress don't progress to heat stroke? Are our health workers trained? Especially our Ashas, Anganwadi workers and our ANMs who are out in the community. And again, like I said, water, electricity, those kind of essential services, are we able to maintain? I remember Chennai when we had the flooding in 2015, so many hospital basements got flooded, electricity was turned off, and people on ventilators died. So those kind of, similarly, we've got reports that if you have the maternal and newborn wards on the top floor of a hospital during heat waves, newborns die. So we have evidences which can make us take the right decisions when we are planning the layout of hospitals and health centers.
Thank you. That's very useful. Let us move on to the next speaker. Dr. Swaminathan, as long as you can stay with us, that will be brilliant. Wonderful. We are moving on to Dr. Jaya Sridhar, who teaches health journalism at the Asian College of Journalism and is a colleague at the Earth Journalism Network. Jaya, over to you. You're muted.
Am I unmuted?
No.
Yeah. So thanks, Joydeep and Manasi and the Earth Journalism Network, and thanks also to Harjeet and Dr. Soumya for setting the stage and covering a good bit of what I was planning to sort of say. I'll keep my remarks short, but as both Harjeet and Dr. Soumya said, because we're seeing these rising global temperatures with no signs of respite, and we're seeing climatic events, cyclones, storms, floods, landslides, droughts, and then more recently and more frequently wildfires. These are becoming more frequent and more intense, in expression. It's fairly a cliched practice to cover these climatic hazards, and we do that quite well in the media. We flood our traditional and social media with the standard coverage, and these events preoccupy us for short periods, and then they're also relatively easier to cover in terms of access to data and sources. We capture those visual descriptions of these climate hazards pretty well, and the human face of these events, the agony and the, mental trauma and loss that accompanies them are all fairly well described by the media. At the same time, behind the scenes, as it were, you're seeing these longer term pernicious changes to our environments, to our habitats, and to our livelihoods. And that's what both Dr. Harjeet and Dr. Samya were mentioning. This gradual rise in sea level, the salinity in coastal hamlets and farmlands, and then more frequent heat waves, and then vector-borne disease outbreaks. All of these also exact sort of a mental health toll, which we're not, sort of taking note of. And the attribution is also an important aspect to this. So how does one go about capturing the mental health side of these more gradual, sort of changes? So this kind of, NELD. So, there are very broad, psychological and existential reactions to what is going on around us, of course. And I just wanted to throw in some new terms, because we always end up using the term eco-anxiety. And, the American Psychological Association defines that as the chronic fear of environmental doom. I just wanted to specify here that it's not something that you'll find in a psychiatry textbook or something like that. It's not a defined pathology, in mental health science as such. So it's more like describing something as a heat wave or describing something as spicy. It's just quite a subjective experience. That's what I wanted to say. So you might want to talk to a few mental health professionals to better understand how to use this term. But right now, be careful about classifying it as a mental health pathology of some sort. So, we can use the term eco-anxiety to describe mental distress. When you see the community going through mental distress, associated with, worsening environmental degradation or ecological crises and so on. And when people express their lived experience of what is happening to their homes, that desolation of their home and environment and habitat, well, that's when they talk about, well, that's when you can apply the term eco-anxiety. There's another term that's coming into currency a lot, and that's ecological grief. So this is a much stronger sort of word. We don't find it that often in the Indian or the local language media, but I love the term. I think this is something that we are getting to experience more and more. And this is the kind of thing which is not captured. I mean, think of coastal communities who lose loved ones or who, lose their livelihoods and so on. What else are they experiencing if not grief? So I think this word ecological grief, maybe local language associations of it, is a slightly stronger way of expressing ourselves in the media. This is not a lightly dismissed, likely to be dismissed thing anymore. Another word, solastalgia, just to throw in some, better vocabulary into the way we are covering the mental health impacts of climate change. Solastalgia is the distress that people feel when they see their homes and their, long cherished and dearly familiar living environments transformed or destroyed beyond recognition. So, nostalgia, but solastalgia is when you're there, right there, but you can't even recognize your own home anymore. And eco-angst, that's yet another term. It's a feeling of despair because of the fragile condition of the overall planet. So these are all new terms. So there are a couple of other terms I want to throw into the mix, which haven't crept into, our coverage. One is quite a strong term. It's the murder of Mother Earth, and the term is, tierracide. So tierracide is the term used to describe how we, that we're killing Mother Earth. That's one thing. Another thing associated with growth, our economic or whatever, development, that is extractive, destructively extractive, and that's earth destroying. That kind of growth, we can describe it as terraphthoric. So that's another sort of new term. But anyway, there's an umbrella term under which all these other words belong, and that's called psychoterratica. Psychoterratica is essentially a term which describes all the various, experiences and feelings, subjective emotions that we go through when we see what's happening around us. And if you're more interested in understanding this a little bit and looking into the etymology, because for journalists, words are our bread and butter. And the richer, the better we can texture our conversations, the stronger we can sort of make our reporting, the better. So you can look up Professor, Glenn Albrecht, formerly University of Australia. Now he's with the School of Geosciences, University of Sydney. He's got a very nice blog page, and he's come up with some other new terms as well. So I just wanted to get back to mental health and away from the semantics. So We already know that mental health accounts for a substantial portion of the global, health burden. And, the most oft quoted National Mental Health Survey in India is from NIMHAS from 2017. And we already know that about 1 in 7 Indians, suffer from one condition or the other, one mental disorder or the other. And this itself represented a doubling of the mental health conditions from 1990. So the add-on to this is, of course, the oft-reported and huge gap between the provision of mental health services, the availability of service providers, and the need out there in the field. So if you look at climate change thrown into this mix, it's just a force amplifier, isn't it? So it's just an amplifier that's going to exacerbate the existing mental health risks and affect who the most. It's already the most dispossessed, the most marginalized, and the most vulnerable people. And who are those people? It's the elderly, it's the young, it's the women, as Dr. Samia said, and other marginalized communities. They're going to bear the brunt of this. But the interesting question is, what do we know about the existing mental health of these people? And, it's like very often they say that unless you had a very mentally comfortable life and then you're suddenly thrown into a situation where, say, you're going through a divorce or the death of a partner or a grown child, but that contrast is what tips you over into mental illness. And there are people who've lived in abject misery for such a long time that they are the most resilient communities. They can take a lot. They've suffered all their lives and they can take a lot. Is that true? I mean, these are the questions we should be asking. And it's very unfair of us to sort of impose certain, sort of middle class notions of mental health and suffering on communities that are at the forefront of climate change. It's very important for us to start having conversations with, mental health professionals about this and really look for the data. Do we have like a good prevalence data on the existing mental health, conditions prevailing among coastal communities in the Bay of Bengal? I mean, I've searched and searched for that data, but couldn't come across, there's a random one story of, one piece of research here or there, that's it. So I believe the question was already asked, what are the existing facilities to tend to the mental health needs of coastal communities? What network of facilities exists? How is that working in the health system? How many referrals do they get and so on? And then try to see whether during times of extreme heat stress, for instance, there is an increase in the number of hospital admissions or people reaching out for psychiatric help, because that's pretty standard and established from other parts of the world, that each time temperatures go up, there is an exacerbation of mental health conditions, and there are greater number of psychiatric hospital admissions, and there's a greater number of people attempting suicide or self-harm and breakdown into anxiety and despair. It's like a tipping point, increased temperatures. The other interesting story idea to look at is also the usage of psychotropic medication, among people with, pre-existing mental conditions. If they are already on treatment, how might heat affect that? So there's some limited evidence to show that the effects of these medications might be disrupted and putting these people in danger. But the underlying mechanisms of exactly how heat affects that, the impact of psychotropic medication on people with mental illness is, is being studied now. So there's limited evidence, but we could look for scholarship around this issue to see what's available in terms of medication and how heat might affect it. That's a really good story to sort of follow up on. If you look at available data from the Asia Pacific region about what are the most common mental health conditions that are being documented as having sort of a significant association with climate hazards, along the coast, the easiest examples that you can pick up from are the Philippines and the Solomon Islands, the island nations and so on. So if you look at data from the Philippines and the Solomon Islands, I mean, there's no surprises that there's a clear sort of a spike in fear, in anxiety, in self-pity, and great emotional distress associated with, the typhoon season. The hurricane season, the typhoon season is strongly associated with that. And with the Solomon Islands, this is sort of precipitated over a morbid and chronic long-term fear of sea level rise. So how does this affect their daily functioning, the way they approach their livelihoods. There's some anecdotal evidence to show that it's like people give up after a point. They fall into a sort of a state of dissociation. They stop fighting. So that's another poorly covered story. Just like we need good mental health in order to be able to roll back the effects of fossil fuels and to fight for, what all of the things that we put into those agreements. Similarly, we need, if people are going to lie back and if people are going to be more accepting of what is happening, I mean, there are things happening every day as we speak, and that's no doubt having a profound impact on our mental health, on the impact, mental health impact on activists all over the world. It can be very depressing in the long run. And how is that going to affect our ability to sort of build resilience and fight back? Apart from this are the long-term depression and anxiety disorders that are associated with the loss of livelihoods as farms get flooded, as livelihoods dry up. And I think we can turn to Dr. Soumya here for some granular data on what happens among women who lose their livelihoods in these coastal villages and so on. So these are some of the elevated psychological risks in vulnerable communities along the coast. I just wanted to sort of finish by highlighting a couple of research gaps. One is we don't really, I mean, there are no large population-based studies with clear links and attributions to climate hazards and psychological health in this part of the world. So a good stories to do may be to push for resources and greater interest from the research community to look more deeply into these issues, and to maybe like, journalists could get together, like do a combined story from around the Bay of Bengal, on what mental health professionals are doing, sort of almost create a network of stories as to this is what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis in their clinic. So capture the human face at the community level. Are they seeing more patients during heat waves? Are they seeing, what do they do? What are they dealing with in the aftermath of a cyclone? For instance, that's one way of looking at it. The other research gap that is, that people are trying to address is, apart from large population-based data, it's also interesting to look at individual stories. So there are mobile apps that are being, given to people to help them track, to journal their own feelings as they live through a wildfire or as they go through some coastal flooding event or a cyclone. So the emotions are tracked over a long period of time to try and understand what are the effects of global warming induced climate change and climate hazards on individuals, and how does that affect their capacity to take decisions, to fight back, to build resilience, to be valued members in their community. So these are long-term studies, but this kind of granular data I felt, could be contributed to by journalists by following up on that fisherman in the aftermath of a cyclone that you interviewed 3 years ago. Keep going back, sort of track him over time, can't be all that difficult, sort of capture his personal journey as to how he's dealing with his emotions and with the loss of his, home and so on over a period of time. What help is he getting from which political party or government or which NGO? How is that helping him, deal with it emotionally? And what is the kind of mental health support he's getting? So this kind of granular data, personal life stories of people over a period of time, including those who are game changers in their fields, like the panchayat leader, for instance. What is he doing? Or a very influential faith leader in that community. I think these stories are very important to capture. They're not being, so this is a huge uncounted sort of a story, long-term personal stories over time that can contribute to granular data collection. So I think I'll stop here and hope I added some value to the discussions that went before.
You sure did. You sure did, Jaya. And you know what has happened? We are inundated with requests saying, can Jaya please put these terminologies on a piece of paper, what they mean, and distribute to all of us.
Sure,
Let's
sure. I'll
share it.
connect you to Professor Albrecht's, sort of blog
Yeah.
page.
Yeah. And many of us are not regular health journalists. We don't do health stories very regularly. So even when you use a term like psychotropic, many of us wonder what you're talking about. So yeah, a sort of understanding as to that. And For everybody in this virtual room, Jaya actually gave a very good story idea for a coordinated cooperative story across geographies. And let me tell everybody that we really, really welcome such story ideas, idea for a story or a series, on from different geographies, journalists working together on the same theme from different geographies, from Bangladesh, from different states in India. Absolutely, we would welcome that. So the call is out there. So look at it, talk to your colleagues, see if you want to come up with joint story ideas, and we shall do it that way. Okay, we are now, we have had a glimpse at the history of this so-called non-economic loss and damage. We have delved relatively deeply into the health impacts of these climate change. Now we are going to look at the basic support structure, the biodiversity and the ecosystem services that exist in these coastal areas specifically, and that is being hit by climate change. And to help us do that, we are very glad to have Dr. Madiha Chaudhuri from the Dhaka-based International Center for Climate Change and Development. Dr. Chaudhuri, over to you. You're muted, ma'am.
Oh, am I audible now?
Yes, you're audible.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jaydeep. And just a small correction, I don't have the title doctor. So yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just feel like the previous speakers have, helped me reduce a lot of time that I have to spend, because they've addressed a lot of the things that I had planned to cover. So I'll just try to keep it. I'm just trying to share my screen. Could you just kindly let me know if it's visible?
It's started, screen sharing has started. Yes, it's visible now. Great.
Thank you. So just a brief introduction that we are basically a think tank based in Dhaka, Bangladesh, International Center for Climate Change and Development. And we have a program on nature, people, and climate. And so basically what I'll be trying to cover today is technically the ecological losses and damages, and that our previous speakers have mentioned that the losses that are happening to our ecosystems and biodiversity. And for just giving an overview of, because I'll be mainly sharing stories from the Bangladesh coast. This is just for an overview about the richness of biodiversity that the global south has, and then just a representation of that, again, zooming into the coastal belt. So IUCN basically categorized the whole of Bangladesh into 25 types of bioecological zones. And among those 25, almost half of those typologies. So we have like around 12 types of bioecological zones just along the coast of the Bay of Bengal in Bangladesh. So that's a representation of just the very varying types of connected ecosystems that we have in this region. And this region is also one of the regions that's most, as our previous speakers have highlighted, most hit by disasters and due to climate change. So not going into this, but the right-hand table is just a overview of the different types of climate change impacts that are happening on the ecosystems along the coast. So coastal erosion, we're losing land, and along with that, because our ecosystems can be broadly divided into two types. So either they're land-based, which are forests, or they're aquatic. So that includes our rivers, our man-made ponds and canals, our wetlands. So due to these disasters, such as coastal erosion, will end up in us losing land, which the immediate impact is loss of the species on that land. And then you will have these due to cyclones and sea level rise, the eventual salinity intrusion, it degrades these on a land, it degrades the soil quality, and in water you would have the salinity of water increasing, which would also affect the environment or the habitat that these species are living in, and eventually definitely have an impact on them. So I just trying to pose a few thinking points or angles that the audience here, specifically our respected journalists, can think from the angles for when they're trying to document the losses and damages due to the impact on ecosystems, is that when we're focusing, there is the scale of impact that we need to think about. So it's a given that our previous speakers have also repeatedly said that we have a lack of data, but just to have a glimpse of how we can look at this from the national to the very local level. So at the national level, and this is in Bangladesh's case, that we do have documentation of different kinds of species that are available, that are under extinction or that are under threat, but this is not periodically or regularly updated. And under the recent plans that are being developed, and this addresses a bit of the attribution aspect, is that we do have the science that is telling us that due to future impacts of climate change, so for instance, a 1 to 2 degrees rise in temperature will result in will result in like 17% decline of overall rice production, or salinity intrusion, which is a slow onset event, will further result in 0.2 million tons or more reduction in rice production. So these are future scenarios that can help us in attributing losses of ecosystems due to climate change. Moving into the more individual or community or societal level, and the reason that I would first like to look at, even though the focus of this webinar was non-economic loss and damage, what I'd like to highlight is that the categorization of loss and damage into economic and non-economic means that they're both actually very interconnected. So, and we are definitely focusing on NELD because it's so much more easier to quantify and put monetary values to the economic aspect. But we're having the non-economic impacts. A lot of them are cascading impacts due to the economic losses and damages that are happening. So just for that interconnection to be established, definitely due to these losses of ecosystem and biodiversity. And again, when we talk about vulnerability, the marginalized are the most impacted. And for them, and again, in the global south, and more specifically in Bangladesh and along the Bay of Bengal, these poor communities are largely dependent, their livelihoods are largely dependent on natural resources. So hence, definitely, as a consequence, they're suffering from loss of income when such climate change impacts are happening. And that's something that's easy to quantify, right? But the examples that I've cited here, for instance, Cyclone Isla happened in 2009, and this fact is from a research conducted in 2012. So we definitely, due to that cyclone, we had immediate losses of agriculture. But what happened between 2009 and 11 is the gradual, because of that cyclone, the amount of salinity that increased in the soil, that resulted in an additional $1.9 million loss in only just 4 villages that were surveyed in a district along the coast that was impacted by the cyclone. So this is another angle to think about and this is where I would like to connect with the previous speaker as a recommendation, that following up on stories is because the data that we have now, or the data that's collected, is usually immediately post-disaster. So we have the post-disaster data immediately documented, but after a certain period of time after the disaster impacts, the consequential impacts that are happening in these livelihoods, have they received the financial aid? Have they received compensation for their losses? Are they being able to cope with whatever damage was incurred immediately during the event? That's another angle to look at. And the second example is, I quoted it just to give a thought on when we're documenting why it's risky or why it's important to document non-economic along with economic losses and damages, is because, for example, this is another cyclone that occurred more recently, and during which, so shrimp farms are basically, so they hold due to the increasing saline water in the coastal areas. More often, it's found that the richer uh, counterparts in a society, they trap the saline water, and they've started shrimp cultivation. So, which by now is a common phenomenon that we know that if initially it was thought of as an adaptation practice, adapting with increasing saline water, but which has now turned into maladaptation because it has only degraded the soil quality in adjacent lands due to intrusion of because when you're holding saline water for such long periods, you're allowing the adjacent lands to reduce in their fertility. So, but during this cyclone, almost 14 bulbul, which happened, almost 14% of shrimp farms were completely lost. And there's a study that estimates that the loss and damage per shrimp farm was that particular amount of US dollars. What I would leave as a thinking aspect here is that when we're documenting economic loss and damage, it's definitely that the amount of loss in terms of money will be greater for the rich compared to poor counterparts, definitely due to how much they own in terms of tangible properties. So, which is why it's so important to interlink the non-economic aspect when we're documenting these. So just this is the interconnection, just just a depiction of that we're losing our ecosystems, we're losing our biodiversity. The immediate impact is a loss in income, but these are the consequential impacts that the society is suffering from. So our previous speakers have talked a lot about the mental health aspect, so I will not go into that. Physical health impact, definitely, because they're losing, not only are they losing their income source, it's also their source of nutrition and food intake. And migration is another aspect that I'd like to link here with loss of ecosystems and biodiversity. Again, because this is an interesting link that I feel like has not been talked about in both, I would say, research and documentation, is that these communities, because rural to urban migration is widely talked about, but just looking at it from this angle, that when these communities are gradually losing their income sources due to the impact of climate change on ecosystems and biodiversity, eventually they're left with no choice but to migrate to other, because their land's becoming uninhabitable, or they're not being able to earn enough in those areas. But migration necessarily, because there's again a lot of studies and talk going on about this as well, the migration will not necessarily ensure that you are going to be better off. And because there will be new vulnerabilities in the area that you're migrating to, there will be new challenges to deal with. So rather than considering migration as a form of adaptation, it can actually lead to more loss and damage. So these are the immediate intangible losses and non-economic losses and damages that we were talking about. And another further aspects, and these are just some quotes, these are stories that were picked, and there's no way, what's to be highlighted here is that there's no way of actually putting value to these or putting a number to these. And this is where we talk about being context specific or value-based non-economic loss and damage, because depending on the socioeconomic characteristics. So for instance, our previous speakers have also talked about intergenerational transfer of knowledge. So these are generations of agriculturists, of fishermen residing in these communities. And when we're just treating this as post-disaster aid, we're not really addressing the loss of social ties or social cohesion that's happening here, which also happens due to migration as well. So they're all just very, very interlinked. And this is just so I kept the conceptual matrix, and Harjit has already addressed this. I will not go deep into it, but just for a familiarization with terms, that what has existed for a long time is, or the in research in academia, is the 4 types of ecosystem services, and an attempt to evaluate them. There are different methodologies for evaluation of these different types of ecosystem services. So there are 4 categories. That this is a very general categorization. But what probably doesn't exist, or is the new aspect in non-economic loss and damage, is the relational value, or the relational aspect, again linking back to the previous slides, that at the end will be at the community level and will vary from community to community, and it will vary from individual to individual. So how much value does a person place to their social ties? How much value does a person place to this specific occupation that they are engaged in? That is something that will remain relational. Just a summary of some of the major challenges and way forwards that I would say would help us move forward in this area is definitely the first challenge is what previous speakers have also repeatedly said, the attribution challenge. So ecosystems, we've been losing ecosystems for a long time due to urbanization. So these are non-climate challenges, right? So pollution, overpopulation, but the fact that climate change is an exacerbator for all of these now, and like I said, we have modelings done now to document it or attribute it for the future. But just to ensure it, so we're learning now that since we didn't have previous baseline data, it's quite difficult, especially for Global South where there are funding constraints, attribution becomes quite challenging. So definitely all of these way forwards call for increased funding. But apart from that, I think highlighting that even if loss of ecosystems and biodiversities have been happening or will be happening due to other man-made reasons, climate change is undoubtedly an exacerbator. Valuation will definitely remain a challenge, and because it's only to a certain degree, like I said in my previous slides, that you can put a monetary value to it. The rest remains on and just to address the part that we're not being able to add value to, so the non-economic aspect, this is where the third recommendation comes in of documentation and record keeping. And I won't go deep into it because the previous speakers have repeatedly highlighted on this. I'll just add an aspect of the rapid onset versus slow onset differences. So I just feel it's very important to keep a lens on the cascading impacts that happen over time. So going back to specific communities over time, keeping track of them, and as well as documenting all of these in a collective. So even though we're doing it at a very micro level, individual or community level, having a larger documentation mechanism for a nation would be helpful to bring this in the eyes at the policy level, because I mean, it's put on 4 and 4, but it's the next 2 recommendations come from this, that what we should be doing to address non-economic loss and damage. And I mean, bringing in this new, it's just new terminologies, and how in the beginning Jadip said that we like putting in jargons. So what is the new value addition that we're re-terming and rephrasing and regrouping this, is that it is a given that these, if when we're not doing it, they're getting undermined at the policy and implementation level. And with regard to ecosystems and biodiversity, we already have a existing challenge, irrespective of economic or non-economic loss and damage, is that their integration with the climate realm, the integration of the biodiversity world with the climate change world. That's both at the global level and as well as at the national level. So for instance, at the national level, we have our national biodiversity strategic action plans made, and they're not really coherent with our national adaptation plans or our NDCs. So that connectivity or intersectoral collaboration is anyways missing. And on top of that, if we're not documenting or bringing in light the non-economic losses and damages that are happening due to climate change impacts on these ecosystem services and biodiversity, we will be undermining a lot of the impacts on the most affected due to climate change. And in terms of the measures that any country is taking in terms of future adaptation planning, this also puts into perspective the importance of taking into account communities or the local people's needs and priorities. So not whether it be hard infrastructure measures or soft measures. And another final aspect I would say is that nature-based solutions is definitely a very good way of addressing ecological non-economic loss and damage, because the heart of NBS is that we incorporate society and people when we're planning nature, and that's how it's differentiated from ecosystem-based adaptation, right? But again, we definitely have the challenge of tracking the outcomes, because all of these, one of the other major challenges with ecosystems and biodiversity is that any intervention taken, the positive or negative impact, whichever comes out of it, the monitoring aspect will take quite a long time. So just having, so funding would also be required to document success stories of interventions or adaptation interventions taken to address ecological loss and damage, because those impacts are not immediate. And I would like to end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very useful summary of the absolute basic foundation on which people live, and that is being affected. We are going to go into more detail on one aspect that Madiha talked about, and that is migration from the coastal areas of Bay of Bengal as a result of these impacts of climate change. And to talk to us about that, we have an expert, Dr. Upasana Ghosh. Upasana, over to you.
Hi, am I audible?
You're audible, not visible yet.
Sorry, I have some problem in the internet, so maybe I cannot turn on my.
Yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about that. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So I would like to share my screen. Do I have the permission?
Yes, you do.
Okay, just a second. Okay, no, I think there are some really bad network, so I can just speak, right?
Okay, go ahead. And if you share your presentation with us later, we'll
Yes.
send it to everybody who's in the room, in this virtual room.
Absolutely. I will do that. I'm so sorry for this technological
Not a
glitch.
problem. Just go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Art Journalism Network, for inviting me and talk about a special population, a most vulnerable population in terms of loss and damage. So I would like to tell you the term which is very common now, that's the climate refugees. So climate refugees is a term which are basically those people who have been forced to leave their traditional habitat or home temporarily, or it can be permanently, because of the environmental disruption. And it's like they have to build the forced to build their lives in other places. And despite any conditions which they are facing in the new relocated areas. So just like my previous speaker mentioned about that. So that the term was actually coined by Lester Brown in 1970, and he termed them as environmental refugees. Then later part in 1985, Hinawi from an UN environmental protection paper, he mentioned the terms as climate refugees. So another term you can also find in various literatures and various documents, that's climatically displaced persons, CDPs, in their own homeland. Means if we are talking about if we are not talking about excuse me, inter-country migration, the intra-country migration people can be called as climatically displaced persons. Now, why these particular populations are important in this entire climate change or loss and damage debate? Because their number are actually very much increasing. So the internal climate migrants by 2050, there is a projections is going to be very high, and it's almost around 170.3 million across the regions done by a survey. So the major chunk is going to be in the Southeast Asian region, which is 35% of the entire climate refugee population, leading by Latin America and of course Africa. So the projections of people are going to be displaced from their own homeland due to climate change impacts are quite high, and that's why we all are very aware about these situations. But still, it's not come into the proper line, because sorry, the limelight they wanted to get, or they should get. So basically, if you see the distributions, Sub-Saharan Africa would be the highest climate refugees, around 86 million, followed by South Asia, around 40 million, and followed by Latin America, around 17 million. So this amount of people, the question is, where would they go? The very difficult questions: where would they go, what they will do, because most of these people are actually very traditional, they belongs to the very traditional livelihoods like agriculture, fishing. If we see the focus in our own coastal regions in India and Bangladesh, especially the Sundarbans region, they are traditional agriculturists or fisher folks. So they know those are their main subsistence pattern. So if you migrate them, if they have to migrate to other cities, they are ending up as the wage laborer, which is an unskilled migration. So forget about we people migrated in other places, in other countries, or in other states. We are going with a particular skill set. So we are welcomed. So these people are not welcomed because there is a huge difference between our migration and their migration. If we see the Indian pattern of this climate refugee migration, you will see all the coastal regions, states, West Bengal, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh. So this migration happened to either the southern state or the central states like Delhi, Ahmedabad, southern state like Kerala, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh. So this pattern of migration is happening. So again, kind of this migration, we can say that's intra-country migration. And the inter-country migration from the southern belt of the states, they are going to the Middle East. So there is a flow going on of skilled and unskilled migrations. Now the southern people going with a particular skill to the Middle East, being a nurse or being a nurse or or the IT professionals, they have a different type of migration. But these people from the eastern region of India, they are migrating to the southern state or the central state, mainly as wage laborer or domestic helps. Now, why this entire climate refugees or internally displaced people located in our entire climate debate? We all know that, climate change has created certain uncertainties. It can be the ecological uncertainty. It can be the knowledge uncertainty. Ecological uncertainty, we all understand. My previous speaker has already told about that. Knowledge uncertainty is what is actually happening within the ground. How much knowledge is there, what actually people are facing, their lived experiences. The knowledge of their lived experiences, their perspective is lacking at the policymaker level or the civil society level or at the researchers and journalist level also. So that knowledge uncertainty is there, which reflected mostly in the policy uncertainty. So there is a gap. I mean, in every aspect, there is a gap between the science and policy. But here, when people are at the stake, we really cannot afford such, knowledge and policy uncertainty. And if these three cycles of uncertainty, ecological knowledge and policy uncertainty come up together, the climate refugees or internally displaced populations are at the middle, at the juncture of these three uncertainties. So that's why this entire debate is very crucial and very difficult to understand. Now, if we see that, many a times there is a comment like people are making their livelihood flexible. But flexible, like if we see the example of Sundarbans, people were doing first the agriculture, then this and the forest collection and fishing. Those were their traditional livelihood. Then they shifted to, bitter leaf cultivation or other cash crops cultivations. Then they started agricultural wage laboring within the island. Then they started crab catching, especially the women, to grab the catches from the jungle reserve forest. Then they started migrated. So there is a continuum of livelihood flexibility, but which is a distressed flexibility. It's a distressed diversification. Livelihood flexibility in an economic loss and damage term is very welcoming. But in terms of the distress livelihood diversification, it's a force. It's socially unjust. So that is really a crucial issue. Now, if we see the pattern of migration across the vulnerable areas, we can divide in three patterns. We can see in three patterns. So first is a permanent migration. So who are those permanently migrating people? Those are mostly the rural elite, educated rural elite, who wanted to have a city life. They are migrating with a different skill set. So, and there are not only the climate change, but there are the effect of globalization process also, urbanization, globalizations, changes in the worldview, like, an agriculturist is not thinking that my son will be an agriculturist. So this this is a very globalization process. So that's happened. Now comes to the seasonal migration. So seasonally migrating people are mostly the male migrants. So male are migrating seasonally, and they are going to the cities to earn some wages and leaving behind the women, children, and elderly. So women became the de facto household heads, which is a very new societal pattern across the rural coastal India. Then comes the intra-island mobility. Like if you take the examples of the Sundarbans in India and Bangladesh, so many people have displaced from their original island to the another island. So that they are not leaving that region, but they are shifting their home almost every 3 years or 5 years, depending upon how much erosions or how much cyclones and floods they are facing. So that is also happening. Then again, a big debate of cross-border migration. We all aware about that. But these borders are very fluid between India, Bangladesh. This border were always fluid and people were migrating. Then comes the Rohingya crisis, which has actually fueled this cross-border migrations. I'm not going to go to that debate. So not the political debate, but this is the reality. Now, Another type of migrations or mobility I would like to mention here, that migration in disguise of marriage or the human trafficking. If we see in this coastal area, girls as young as 14, 15, they are getting married. They are in many a times they are trafficked in the disguise of marriage. So there is they became the victim of this sex trafficking, which I would say another type of migration that we need to highlight in stories and research. Boys also, they are also similarly vulnerable. Boys as young as 12, 13, 15, they are also joining the marginal workforce as migrated laborers. So basically, the adolescents, boys and girls, the entire section of the adolescents are actually facing, they are the victim of this climatic loss and damage. And all are not economic, but the socially unjust loss and damage. So why people are doing that? Many a times we talk to the people and they say that this region, we are choosing survival over the identity. My identity as a coastal people, or my identity as a farmer, or my identity as a people of Sundarbans, I don't want that identity. I want my survival, my children's survival more than that. So that is people's perspective, which we need to understand and report more and more. So they feel like living here is a dangerous and it's a very uncertain life. So they don't want to live in that uncertainty. They want to, especially for their children, they want their children to get out of that. So that's very hard reality. But of course, that's the reality. And in between, in this entire chaos, they have struggles. They have the intergenerational struggles. They have interreligious struggles. The struggles between the genders, struggles between the homeless and those people who have still have the shelters, landowner, landless, those who have agricultural lands, people who lost their agricultural lands, and which are manifested basically in the political violence. So all these struggles are going on in these chaotic situations, which are definitely very, very crucial to understand and report. I would urge you to report correctly. Now, if we look, shift our view to a different perspective, that what would happen if you migrate without a particular skill? First, definitely, this is across region. It's actually true. You have to adjust to a new setting, new language, new culture, new social practice. You have to live in a urban slums or in a very unhygienic situation. And of course, you are prone to physical, mental, nutritional health and well-being, and subject to violence, deprivation, and all sort of marginalization. Because in India, if we focus that there is hardly any data set about how much this intra-country and inter-country mobility and migration is happening. So, and recognizing this climate migration is, it's not yet into the policy debate. Now, if we shift our focus to the people who are leaving behind, means who are actually staying within these vulnerable regions, there is a huge impact on their health, well-being, and their physical, mental, and nutritional well-being. So especially the women and the children who are staying behind, they are facing the major challenges. Seasonal migration is often not possible for the woman because of the patriarchal rules, or they have to stay behind to take care of the children, elderly, and whatever the leftover resources they are having. So they are also joining the marginal workforce and doing the all sort of crab catchings, or they're trying to do some jobs or jobs available within the coastal region, which they are adapting to support the family's economic conditions. Now, the effect of this migrations of male and staying behind of the woman are creating the large social disruptions. So major social disruption we can see in terms of the domestic violence and mental stressors. So we already talked, my previous speakers have already talked about the mental health issues. I totally agree, there is no data. Being a health researcher, I myself tried, but anyways, that's funding is very limited. So we yet not have any data that can establish that how much this domestic violence and mental challenges, mental stress are happening within this entire area. We can also see this, breaking of the joint families. So the woman who is getting it's her de facto newly get de facto power of running a household, doing a man's job. So they are feeling why they don't want to, be in the regulations of the elderly in-laws, but still she is under her husband, because for any important decisions she has to call her husband who is seasonally migrate and take a decisions. So all these processes are happening, but the women, they have a newfound kind of empowerment because they are handling every situation alone. They are very aspirational. So their life stories are very interesting to know about, how they are perceiving these things. Now, why we need to understand this climate migration is a loss and damage debate, because they're losing their traditional and cultural knowledge. They are losing that. They were the fisher folks. They were, if we take the example of Sundarbans, both in India and Bangladesh, the people, irrespective of their religion, being Hindu or Muslims, they were worshipping the Bon Bibi. The cult of Bon Bibi was a deity of the jungle. So they're losing their cultural. If you see now, they are not worshipping Bon Bibi the way they were doing previously, because they are not depending on the jungle anymore. They are going for wage laboring, where the mainstream religion will play a more, focus shelter. They are thinking that these mainstream deities like Durga or Kali or Shiv or Allah, they can protect them in that new situation more than Bon Baby. So here is a loss of traditional and cultural knowledge, the loss of identity and heritage, losing of all sort of traditional livelihoods, alteration in the social network and the family structure, psychological challenges adjusting in new settings. All this should come under the loss and damage debate, which is non-economical. And we need to create stories more and more regarding this. Now, what can be done with this, with this climate refugees? There are certain laws: international refugee law, international climate law, international human rights law. We can bring them into that, but yet globally there is no, conventions, or still now there is nothing concrete that comes up to categorize these people. So we always have to remember that, this particular people are specifically vulnerable. They have some specific needs. They have some specific strategies they need. We cannot give a blanket approach to them, which we are giving to any kind of vulnerable populations. They have their own challenges. And definitely their mental, physical, and nutritional well-being is very crucial, both the people who are migrating and people who are staying behind. So both kind of groups need
Excuse me, Dr.
special
Ghosh.
attention.
Dr. Ghosh, there isn't much time left, and there's another speaker.
I'm
May I
done. I'm
request you to
done. Thank
wrap
you
up?
so much.
Oh,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much. I'm
Thank you
done.
so much. I'm sure all of us I did a lot of story ideas from that. And thank you. And I can see that you have a cough, and thanks for
Yeah, I'm
joining
sorry.
despite
I
that.
have a
Yeah,
really bad throat.
thanks a lot for joining despite that. Now we are going to move to Ritu Gupta of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. She is a gender expert. And what she is going to do is to stitch together all we have heard, the various aspects through a gendered lens. Over to you, Ritu.
Thank you, Joydeep. Thank you, everyone. I have really learned a lot from all the speakers who've gone before me. And thank you, EJN, for providing this opportunity for CGRF to actually come and speak about the work that we've been doing, especially integrating gender into the loss and damage portfolio. So a lot has been already shared in terms of non-economic loss and damage by my colleagues. What is loss and damage, what is non-economic loss and damage, and how it's inextricably also linked with economic loss and damage. I will particularly bring in the gendered impact of the non-economic loss and damage. So what we've heard from our previous speakers before, that we all know that there is a disproportionate impact of climate change on marginalized populations such as women, girls, youth, people with disabilities, gender diverse people. But why does that happen? I will actually bring attention to that and what we can do. And I will also share what CGRF, Climate Justice Resilience Fund, is doing as a donor in this space, as a funder in this space. So I'll quickly share my slide here. I had prepared good number of a few slides, but I think I'll skip them because a lot has already been covered by my colleagues. So just yeah, so I will talk about why we know that gender, there is a disproportionate impact of climate change. And we've heard different types of non-economic loss and damage in terms of biodiversity loss, forced migration, and migration, and also in education. There were questions around education, also on physical and mental health. But why does that happen? So I will also bring in this point of that there are already existing inequalities. I think Madiha touched upon this point. The structural inequalities are already there. For example, gender equality, colonialism, racism, casteism, ableism, ageism, patriarchy, extractive industries. There are all sorts of structural inequalities that exist. And then climate change adds as a stressor, additional stressor. And what happens in that case, then women and different marginalized groups are often excluded from the decision-making process. So they are the ones who are facing the brunt of the climate change. They are the ones who are facing the loss and climate-induced loss and damage, but they are the ones who are excluded from any kind of dialogue and decision-making process. They also have limited access to resources. For example, historically, we know that women do not have much access to the land. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan also raised a point of that while both men and women are fisher folks, but men have access to insurance, whereas women do not have. They have less access to formal education and also technology, making it harder to recover from the climate-related losses and damages. And then there are social and cultural norms, gender norms that relegate women to the boundaries of household and limits their mobility, freedom. We heard from Dr. Soumya Swaminathan when she shared that fisher women who are fisher folks are mostly involved in the post-harvest work, which includes a lot of drudgery. So historically, we've seen that in the value chain also, even when women are involved in a lot of agricultural work, but are they able to make decisions on the money that they earn from that agricultural work? Can they spend it without discussing it with the head of the household? Mostly are men. I will also touch upon some of the points that Dr. Upasana Ghosh at the end, she shared, that women are the de facto head of the household when men are migrating. I'll also bring in another lens to it. So what we can do is, and what we are also doing at CJRF, I think I would like to say that climate justice is not truly just without an intersectional lens. So we need to bring in an intersectional lens, not just by looking at like how, putting it in a binary sense, like, okay, how men and women are impacted differently, but bringing an intersectional approach that not only ensures that women and marginalized communities and those facing multiple forms of oppression and discrimination based on their race, caste, identity. So race is not so much valid here in our context of the Bay of Bengal, but caste, their socioeconomic condition, their education status, and their age, their gender. Not just that, but also addresses the power imbalances, which basically ensures or sometimes includes or excludes the community voices in climate solutions. So intersectionality helps confront the harmful power structures and also tackle the system of oppression that, or structural inequality that I mentioned, of colonialism, capitalism, extractive industries, gender inequality. And Harjeet brought one point of 2 points which really stood out for me. One is the capacity constraint with the community and also the government. And pretty much all the speakers spoke about the limited data being available on the NELD. So here in the CGRF, what we are working with the principle of self-determination, that communities or the grantee partners and the communities that the grantee partners are serving, they are the ones will identify and determine what is non-economic loss and damage for them, which bucket they want to put it in, how they see that loss and damage for them, how is it impacting them. They determine that, and we as a funder create a space, create resources for bridging that capacity. We are intentionally not calling it capacity strengthening or capacity building, because then it divides the community of the existing capacity, the knowledge, the traditional knowledge that they already have, the solutions that they have been building, like they have been identifying that would help them to overcome these climate crises that they are facing. So bridging the capacity in whatever form that they identify, and just being there to meaningfully and intentionally including them, listening to them. Then participatory and inclusive processes. So as a funder, we are also into participatory grant making. How do we include the voices intentionally and meaningfully, include the voices of the communities who are at the forefront of climate crisis, how they can bring in, come to the table and talk about what is it that they're experiencing, what the solution building process will look like, and how the grant making can be informed by that, by making flexible grant making, non-restrictive funding, eliminating the bureaucracy of long due diligence processes. So how do we actually create or co-create the solutions with the communities and follow up participatory and keep the intersectionality and the lived experiences rooted in the local context in the process at the center. And international support and funding. So advocacy plays a major role where platforms like creating a small grants fund or creating resources for the marginalized people from the marginalized communities to be at the table, not other people representing them, not the privileged folks representing the marginalized folks. So they themselves can actually be in these decision-making forums, engage in the dialogue, such as COP, such as SBs in UNFCCC bodies, and then funding mechanisms like Fund to Respond to Loss and Damage can directly allocate resources to the impacted communities, and ensuring that the communities who are impacted by the climate change, the loss and damage that they are, non-economic loss and damage that they're experiencing, have the support needed for resilience, for adaptation, to recover from the trauma and the stress that at least to cope up with that, if not completely recover from that. I would also bring in the point of feminist economics, which I've not added here. So what happens when men migrate out of, like, to other cities? The women, when they become the household, head of the household, not just become the head of the household, there is an increased unpaid care burden that falls on them. So what happens then? They are the ones in charge of not only just collecting fuel and arranging for food and looking at livestock and agriculture, but they are also the ones who are involved in childcare and elderly care, leaving very little time for their self-care or their nutrition and their food intake, etc. And I would also talk about the impact of heat stress that we've spoken about. So bringing in a lens of like looking at this whole non-economic loss and damage in the areas of labor, migration, and climate change. So what's happening, the point that Dr. Soumya Swaminathan was sharing about, that inside temperatures are even more harmful than outside, or more than the temperatures outside. So what's happening to the domestic workers? What's happening to the garment factory workers? There's a lot of work that's being done, still quite inadequate or in nascent stages. But what happens to them as a result of heat stress? Because in the coastal area, or in the climatic condition that we have in India, the kind of heat waves that are going on. So centering feminist economics, which talks about the increased unpaid care burden on the women and young girls. Someone asked a question about the impact on education while there are school dropouts that are happening and school closures, but there's often seen that girl child are the more vulnerable ones who are pulled out of the school, and they then get engaged in the unpaid care burden, taking the responsibility of household chores, and eventually they become the burden for the family. For example, from feminist economic lens, they're like one less mouth to feed. So then what happens? Okay, let's get rid of the girl child. So getting them married off to a much older man in the city, and then it leads to the child early or forced marriage. So the entire childhood, or this huge loss of opportunity that's happening. So there's this perpetuation of cycle of economic that leads to the non-economic loss and damage, and then again leads to the economic loss and damage. Then Jaya was talking about the mental health impact, and the point for the journalists, I think we're talking about the trauma that the community members go through when they face any kind of climate change. I would just like to say that one thing that you need to also be careful of when you're talking to the people who have experienced this, how like you may be actually scratching their trauma and reminding them of the memories which are very painful. So being careful about that. And often we think just about the people we are talking about, like how do you actually map the life history, or say in the last 3 years, how the climate change has impacted them. But it is also equally important to care for the self, because when we are engaging in a story writing or report writing, or bringing the lived experiences of someone into the story, we are also equally impacted by that trauma. So how do we also care for the self while engaging the community members with a lot of sensitivity? So lastly, I would like to conclude. I have a lot of points that I can go on and on, but I would like to conclude by saying that it is not climate justice if it is not intersectional. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ritu. Okay, I think I don't know about the entire room, but at least I have got at least a dozen story ideas. So in a webinar for journalists, I think we cannot ask our speakers to do any more. That's absolutely wonderful. And we still haven't looked at, because of lack of time, one or two, at least one or two important parts of loss and damage. I don't like to use that term non-economic because I think lots of things are economic. One is we haven't delved into the educational losses and damages in detail, except to say that, okay, some days are being lost. How many days? What does it do to the education? What happens to the kids who are in the middle of their board year? What happens to the students who have to give their exams, whether it's for end of school or graduation or whatever. And Ritu pointed out, and actually I haven't seen a single story on this particular thing from South Asia, that when schools close and when they reopen, girls are pulled out more than boys. We have seen stories about girls being married off early, but what happens before that? They're pulled out of school. So the education angle hasn't been looked at by us today in detail because of lack of time. Another aspect we really haven't looked at is culture, the social and cultural heritage of people. I mean, I still distinctly remember what a fisherwoman in Vizag told me 8 years ago. We were talking about how the village in which she used to live had gone under the sea and they had moved across. And while talking, she said, "You know what hurts me most? The tree under which I got married is now underwater." So there is a tradition that they get married under the tree, and that tree is now gone. So these are intangible cultural heritage issues that really, I think, can do with a lot of stories. Another thing I'll tell all my journalist colleagues is that when you do these stories, not only are they good stories, they also have impact. 7, 8 years ago, there were hardly any stories being done along this Bay of Bengal coast on the health impacts of having to drink and cook with water that's gone too saline. We had a project, again, in partnership with CGRF, and we mentored a large number of journalists in both Bangladesh and India, and a very large number of stories came out from Bangladesh, from Sundarbans, Odisha, Andhra, on this particular aspect as to how blood pressure is going up, unless you can actually afford to have RO water or mineral water, and how that is especially very, very dangerous for pregnant women. So it has had impact. So what I'm trying to tell my colleagues is that if you do good stories, it has impact. 8 years back, Bangladesh did not have one RO plant for drinking water in almost every village. Now, almost every village in coastal Bangladesh has it. The water was saline enough even 10 years ago, but the awareness has increased a lot now. So go for it. Absolutely. I can see Harjeet's hand is up, and then Ritu's.
Ritu was
Harjeet?
before me. Ritu, please go ahead.
Okay, Ritu.
Thank you. Just one more thing, Joydeep. So the point that you raised, like education has not been explored much. The cultural and traditional traditions, lots of culture and tradition has not been explored much. And in addition to that, under physical health, I think we touched upon briefly, but that is also one unexplored, completely unexplored area of sexual and reproductive health and rights of women, like because of this salinization, increased salinization in the salt and the water, what's happening to the women's health? Several gynecological issues, the increased urinary tract infections. So these are some of the issues which are completely like nobody pays attention to it. Like, okay, this can also be non-economic loss and damage. So again, this is also connected to like men migrating of the household, and then women are taking all of it. So then what's happened? So yeah, I just wanted to add that as well. Over to you, Harshit.
Yeah, very, very quickly, and thank you, Jyoti, for bringing those stories. So just to so one, I think we are stuck with this terminology NELD, but I was fighting about it at the Warsaw International Mechanism Executive Committee meetings, but it has not been taken forward. I would again characterize it as social, cultural, and environmental impact, so that we start really unpacking all three pillars. Then talking about we need finance to address so-called non-economic loss and damage. It should not create a notion that non-economic means non-financial. That's point number two. Point number three is there are a number of stories that can be created if we really look at the interface of each slow onset event and the range of impacts on social, culture, environmental aspects. As I said earlier, we take biodiversity, it has impacts across social, cultural, and environmental related, right? Take ocean acidification, it can bring number of stories. The issue that we really don't talk about in this region, we're talking about Bay of Bengal, but ocean acidification, not much is being talked about. Salinity, yes, but not ocean acidification part. Similarly, glacier melt. So each issue can bring us a lot of stories. And then what you were saying about culture, I also wanted to underline that point. So loss of culture has a direct mental health impact. So those two are separate impacts and connected. That can bring a lot of new stories. That how when you don't have that tree where you were married, or those cultural sites and burial sites, that also puts a lot. So I think there are a number of stories that can be written about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I can see that we are 1 minute beyond our scheduled ending time. I just, however, in case any of the panelists wants to have a very 10-second last word, go for it. Anybody? No? Okay. Then thanks a lot. Thanks everybody.
Madiha
And-
had hand up. Thanks
Yeah,
everyone
sorry.
for story writing.
Yeah. Thanks. Yes, absolutely. So thanks everybody. Thanks especially to the panelists.
Madiha, I think Madiha wants to speak.
Yeah, oh sorry, hand is up. Yeah, Madhya, go ahead.
It's just a closing 10 seconds, like you said, that I would just to the audience that at a time when we are still, like Harjit said, that unpacking NELD, just the importance of these stories. I would just like to highlight that for the journalists. And for us researchers, it helps with data triangulation very largely. So, I mean, the gravity is high. So, yeah. Thanks to everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Madhya. Thanks for pointing that out. And I know that there were questions in the Q&A from very good journalists about where do we get the data for this? And that is a very good question. We actually haven't had the time today to go into this, but many of our panelists pointed out there is a lack of data. And when there is a lack of data, does it mean we don't do stories? It doesn't mean that. Let's do stories with the micro data that we have. Let's do anecdotal stories. These anecdotes add up to data. Unless we start somewhere, we'll just keep worrying that, oh, there's no data. How do I do my story? So if there is, of course, it's excellent when there is data, and we will continue to look for it. But when there is actually no data, does that mean we don't do stories? No. Let's do the stories. Let's do the stories from the going to the field, doing the anecdotes, and with these anecdotes will add up to data. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thanks. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.